Olivia was excited to have the house to herself. Her parents had left earlier that morning for a weekend getaway, leaving her in charge. At 17, she was used to responsibility, and honestly, she welcomed the solitude. The evening started like any other. She made herself a bowl of popcorn, settled on the couch, and turned on a crime thriller she'd been meaning to watch. Outside, rain began to drizzle softly, a soothing backdrop to her night in. The house was an older suburban build, large but creaky, with its share of odd noises. Olivia had grown used to the occasional groan of the pipes or the gentle rattle of the windows during storms. Tonight, though, something felt different. She noticed it first when the lights flickered, just for a second, barely enough to draw concern. She glanced at the overhead bulb, waiting to see if it would happen again, but it didn't. Shrugging, she turned back to the TV. Then came a knock. It was so faint she almost missed it, blending in with the rain against the window. Pausing the movie, she strained to listen, her head tilted toward the front of the house. Knock, knock. This time, it was louder, clearer. Her stomach tightened. "Who's knocking this late?" she muttered, standing cautiously. The clock on the wall read 11:23 p.m. Approaching the door, she glanced through the peephole. Nothing. The porch was empty, bathed in the warm glow of the light above the door. Knock, knock. Her heart skipped. The sound hadn't come from the door. It came from the window next to the couch. She whipped around, her pulse racing as she approached the living room window. The rain distorted her view, but she saw no one outside. "Probably just my imagination," she whispered, trying to calm herself. Her phone buzzed, and she jumped, fumbling to grab it from the coffee table. The screen showed an unknown number. "Why aren't you answering the door?" Her breath caught. She stared at the text, her mind spinning. Was this a prank? One of her friends messing with her? Before she could respond, another knock echoed, louder this time, more insistent. Olivia's hands trembled as she approached the front door again. She peeked through the peephole, but saw only the empty porch. Her phone buzzed again. "You shouldn't ignore me." Olivia locked the front door and stepped back, her breathing shallow. She tried calling her mom, but the call went straight to voicemail. Her dad's number did the same. "Of course," she muttered. Great timing. She decided to text her best friend Mia. "Hey, someone's messing with me. Getting weird texts. Can you call me?" A reply came almost instantly. "On my way. Don't answer the door." Olivia's heart eased slightly. Mia lived just a few blocks away. She'd be here in minutes. But as she glanced back at the window, her relief vanished. A figure stood in the yard. It was barely visible through the rain, a shadowy silhouette, motionless beneath the streetlight. Olivia's stomach churned as she slowly backed away. Her phone buzzed again. "I see you." Her hands shook as she typed a reply. "Who is this? What do you want?" The response came almost immediately. "To come inside?" Olivia dropped her phone. The figure outside moved, stepping closer to the house. She grabbed a heavy vase from the coffee table, her knuckles white as she gripped it. The rain masked the sound of the approaching footsteps, but she could see them now. Boots splashing in the puddles, coming toward the window. She froze, her eyes locked on the figure. Knock, knock. It wasn't at the door this time. It came from the glass, just inches from her face. Olivia stumbled back, dropping the vase in her panic. It shattered on the floor, the sound sharp and jarring in the tense silence. She clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. The figure outside remained motionless, its face obscured by the shadows. Rain cascaded down the window, distorting its shape. For a moment, she thought it was gone, a trick of the rain, but then it moved again. The figure leaned forward, placing a hand on the glass. Its fingers were long, too long, leaving wet streaks as they pressed against the pane. Olivia froze, her chest heaving with shallow breaths. Her phone buzzed again on the floor. The sound seemed deafening in the quiet. Slowly, she crouched to pick it up, her eyes never leaving the window. "Let me in, Olivia." Her heart felt like it stopped. She hadn't told anyone her name. Fingers trembling, she typed back, "Who are you?" The figure cocked its head, as if hearing her question through the glass. Then it pointed toward the front door. "No," Olivia whispered, shaking her head. "No way." She backed away from the window, grabbing the largest kitchen knife she could find from the counter. The figure vanished from the glass, and for a moment, there was only the sound of rain. Then came the knocking, rapid, frantic, pounding against the door. Olivia screamed, running up the stairs 2 at a time. Her bedroom felt like a safe haven as she slammed the door shut and locked it. She pressed her ear against the wood, listening intently. The knocking had stopped. Instead, she heard footsteps. They weren't coming from downstairs. They were coming from the hallway outside her room. Olivia pressed her back against the far wall of her room, clutching the knife like a lifeline. The footsteps outside grew louder, slower, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there was savoring the moment. "Go away," she screamed, her voice cracking. The footsteps stopped directly outside her door. "Olivia," a voice called softly. It wasn't muffled by the door. It sounded as though it were right beside her, whispering into her ear. She choked back a sob, gripping the knife tighter. Her phone buzzed again, but this time she didn't look. She couldn't. The voice came again, gentle but unnerving. "Why are you hiding? I just want to come in." Suddenly, the door rattled violently, as though someone were trying to tear it off its hinges. Olivia screamed, her knees buckling as she slid to the floor. The rattling stopped. She dared to open her eyes, her breath hitching as she saw the doorknob slowly turning. "Olivia," the voice said again, now deeper, angrier. The door burst open, slamming against the wall. Olivia raised the knife, ready to strike, but the figure standing in the doorway was not what she expected. It was Mia. "Mia," Olivia stammered, lowering the knife slightly. Her friend stepped into the room, her clothes soaked from the rain. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Olivia, what's going on? I've been trying to call you." Olivia blinked, confused. You texted me. You said not to answer the door." "I didn't text you," Mia interrupted, shaking her head. Before Olivia could respond, her phone buzzed again. She hesitated, then picked it up, her heart sinking as she read the message. "Now I'm inside." The lights flickered, and the room was plunged into darkness. The room was silent, save for the faint sound of rain tapping against the window. Olivia's hands trembled as she clutched the knife, her breath shallow and uneven. Mia stood frozen beside her, staring at the phone in Olivia's hand. "Now I'm inside. What does it mean?" Mia whispered, her voice shaking. Before Olivia could answer, a soft creak came from the hallway. Both girls turned toward the open door, their eyes straining to see into the darkness. "Mia, did you lock the front door?" Olivia asked, her voice barely audible. Mia hesitated. I thought I did." A cold dread settled over them. From the shadows of the hallway, faint footsteps echoed, growing louder with each passing second. Olivia raised the knife, her grip tightening as the air seemed to grow colder. Then the footsteps stopped. "Mia, stay behind me," Olivia whispered, her eyes locked on the doorway. But Mia didn't move. Olivia turned to look at her friend, and her blood ran cold. Mia's face had changed. Her expression was blank, her eyes dark and empty, like twin voids staring back at Olivia. "Mia," Olivia whispered, stepping back. Mia smiled, a slow, unnatural smile that stretched too far across her face. "You shouldn't have let me in," she said, her voice layered with an eerie echo. Before Olivia could react, the lights flickered back on, illuminating the room. The Mia standing in front of her wasn't Mia anymore. Her body twisted unnaturally, her limbs elongating as her smile widened further, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Olivia screamed, stumbling backward as the thing lunged at her. She swung the knife wildly, but it passed through the creature like smoke. The door slammed shut, and the last thing Olivia saw was the creature's hollow eyes as it whispered, "Now you're mine." The next morning, Olivia's parents returned home to find the house eerily quiet. The front door was locked, the lights turned off, and there was no sign of their daughter. Upstairs in Olivia's bedroom, her phone lay on the floor, its screen cracked and flashing a single unread message. "Your turn." Eric stood in the middle of his new living room, a mixture of pride and exhaustion washing over him. The house wasn't much, a modest single story with outdated carpet and creaky floorboards, but it was his first home. After years of saving and scraping by in tiny apartments, he finally had a place to call his own. The move had been exhausting. Unpacking boxes, hauling furniture, and dealing with an uncooperative internet setup had taken most of his day. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, Eric decided to call it a night. He tossed a frozen pizza into the oven and sat down on the couch, surveying the scattered boxes still waiting to be unpacked. Outside, the faint hum of crickets and the occasional passing car were the only sounds breaking the stillness. The neighborhood was quiet, almost eerily so. Eric grabbed the remote and flipped through the channels until he landed on a movie. As he settled in with his dinner, the sense of calm began to sink in. This was home now, and for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. But the peace didn't last long. A faint knock broke through the quiet, soft and deliberate. Eric's head snapped toward the door, his heart skipping a beat. It was past 11 p.m., too late for visitors. Knock, knock. This time it was louder, more insistent. Eric stood, glancing at the door nervously. He walked over, flipping on the porch light before peeking through the peephole. Nothing. The yard was empty, the street beyond deserted under the pale glow of the streetlights. Knock, knock. The sound didn't come from the door this time. It came from the window behind him. Eric spun around, his chest tightening. The curtains were drawn, but he swore he saw the faint outline of a figure just beyond the glass. He approached the window cautiously, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek out. The porch light illuminated the yard, but again, there was no one there. Probably just a prank, Eric muttered, trying to shake off the unease. He sat back down, but before he could relax, his phone buzzed on the coffee table. He picked it up, frowning at the message from an unknown number. "Do you like the house?" Eric's stomach sank as he stared at the message. His mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was a neighbor playing a prank, or someone who'd had this number before him. He typed a reply. "Who is this?" The response came almost instantly. "A friend." A chill ran down Eric's spine. He typed again, his fingers trembling. "What do you want?" The answer was immediate. "To make sure you're never alone." Eric stood and pulled the curtains back, scanning the yard for any sign of movement. It was empty, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave him. He locked the doors and checked the windows one by one, ensuring everything was secure. His phone buzzed again. "That won't help." Eric's chest tightened as he spun around, his eyes darting to every shadow in the room. His breath quickened, and his pulse pounded in his ears. A knock echoed through the house, louder this time. It came from the back door. Eric hesitated. "Who's there?" he called, his voice shaky. No answer. He grabbed the kitchen knife and crept toward the back door, his footsteps slow and deliberate. The door was locked, but the blinds over the small window were slightly open. He peered through, expecting to see nothing. Instead, a face stared back at him. It was pale and featureless, its eyes dark and hollow. Eric stumbled back, dropping the knife as the face pressed closer to the glass. Knock, knock. The sound was deafening now, echoing through the quiet house. Eric scrambled for his phone, dialing 911 with trembling hands. The operator's calm voice came through. "911. What's your emergency?" "There's someone outside my house," Eric stammered, his words tumbling over each other. "They're at my back door." The line went dead. Eric backed into the living room, his chest heaving. The knocking had stopped, but the house felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. His phone buzzed again. He didn't want to look, but his hands moved on their own, lifting the device to his face. "You shouldn't have looked." A low creak came from the hallway leading to the bedrooms. Eric froze, his blood running cold. He hadn't gone down there since moving in. The sound came again, louder this time, like someone shifting their weight on the creaky floorboards. "Who's there?" Eric shouted, his voice breaking. Silence. Then footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving toward him. Eric grabbed the knife again, his hands slick with sweat. He backed toward the front door, keeping his eyes on the hallway. The shadows seemed to deepen, stretching unnaturally toward him. A figure stepped into view. It was the same pale, hollow-faced figure he'd seen at the back door. But now it was inside. Its movements were jerky, its limbs too long, its head tilting unnaturally to one side. "You invited me in," it whispered, its voice hollow and distant. Eric didn't wait. He threw the door open and bolted into the night, his bare feet splashing through puddles as he ran down the empty street. When he looked back, the figure was standing in the doorway, watching him. Eric spent the night at a motel, too terrified to return to the house. He called the police, but when they searched the property, they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints in the yard. "You're probably just tired," the officer said, patting his shoulder. "Moving can be stressful." Eric wanted to argue, but he knew it was pointless. He sold the house 2 weeks later. The new owner was a woman named Claire, who had just finalized her divorce and wanted a fresh start. She moved in with her 2 dogs, excited to make the house her own. Her first night passed uneventfully, but the second night, as she unpacked boxes in the living room, she received a text from an unknown number. "Do you like the house?" When 21-year-old Hannah moved into her grandparents' old house, she didn't expect much excitement. The house was a creaky, sprawling Victorian relic tucked away in a rural part of the state. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still, dusty furniture, yellowed wallpaper, and a quiet that pressed down on you like a weight. Hannah had been tasked with cleaning it out after her grandparents passed, a process her parents assured her would take a couple of weeks. She didn't mind being alone, but by the third night, the isolation began to feel oppressive. The house had a locked attic. Her grandparents had always told her not to go up there, and the heavy, iron lock on the attic door seemed to emphasize their warning. Growing up, Hannah had never questioned it, chalking it up to old family quirks. But now, the door seemed wrong. It was the middle of the night when she first heard it. A faint scratching sound like nails on wood. Hannah sat up in bed, her heart racing. She listened intently, straining to hear over the wind howling outside. The scratching came again, followed by a faint creak, like a door opening. She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, the weak beam casting eerie shadows across the hallway as she stepped out of her room. "Hello," she called softly, her voice barely above a whisper. No answer. The scratching continued, louder now, coming from the attic. Hannah stared at the locked door, its iron lock gleaming faintly in the moonlight. It was impossible. She hadn't touched the lock, and she was the only one in the house. The scratching stopped. Then came a voice, low and muffled, from behind the door. "Hannah!" Hannah stood frozen in the hallway, her breath catching in her throat. The sound of her name, soft, almost pleading, echoed in her ears. It couldn't be real. She was alone in the house. Her gaze shifted to the lock on the attic door, its iron surface gleaming faintly in the moonlight. The key, her grandmother had always said, was somewhere safe, but Hannah had never thought to look for it. Now, she wasn't so sure she wanted to. The air in the hallway felt colder than it should have, and Hannah's skin prickled with unease. She backed away slowly, retreating to the kitchen where the warm glow of a night light offered a small sense of security. Her hands trembled as she opened the old wooden drawer by the stove, the one her grandmother had always kept locked with a tiny brass key. To her surprise, it slid open easily. Inside was a small, ornate key, its edges worn with time. Hannah stared at it, her chest tightening. It looked old, too old, and carried an unsettling weight even in its stillness. Beside it was a folded note in her grandmother's familiar handwriting. "Do not open the attic door. No matter what you hear, no matter what you see, please, Hannah, don't let it out." Her stomach churned as she reread the note. Her grandparents had always been loving, pragmatic people, never prone to superstition or fear. But the urgency in her grandmother's words left her unsettled. And then she heard it again, the faint scratching from the attic. Hannah paced the kitchen, the key clutched tightly in her hand. Her mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was a raccoon, a bird, or some other animal that had somehow gotten trapped up there. Maybe the house was just old, and the noises were nothing but the groaning of aging wood. But the voice, she couldn't explain that. "Hannah, Her name came again, softer this time, but unmistakable. The sound rooted her to the spot, every nerve in her body screaming at her to run. Instead, she found herself walking toward the attic door, her bare feet creaking against the floorboards. The house seemed to shift around her, its shadows deeper, the air heavier. When she reached the door, she hesitated. Her hand hovered over the lock as she whispered, "Who's there?" The voice replied instantly, its tone desperate. "It's me. Let me out. Please, Hannah." Her heart skipped. The voice was familiar, but warped, like a recording played on old, damaged tape. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The silence that followed was deafening. Then the scratching resumed, louder this time, more frantic. Against every instinct, Hannah slid the key into the lock. It turned with a reluctant click, and the iron lock fell into her hand, heavier than she expected. Her fingers trembled as she pushed the door open. The attic was dark, the faint light from the hallway barely reaching inside. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of decay made her stomach turn. "Hannah!" The voice came again, but this time it was everywhere, surrounding her, filling the space. She raised her phone's flashlight, the weak beam cutting through the darkness. The attic was empty, just piles of old furniture, trunks, and broken knickknacks. But then she saw it. In the far corner, something moved. The figure in the corner shifted, its form barely visible in the dim light. Hannah took a step back, her phone shaking in her hand. "Who's there?" she whispered again, her voice cracking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it rose slowly, its movements unnaturally fluid, like smoke taking shape. Hannah's breath hitched as she saw it fully. A humanoid form, impossibly tall, its face shrouded in shadow. It took a step toward her, and she stumbled back, nearly dropping her phone. "You shouldn't have opened the door," it said, its voice low and resonant, echoing inside her skull. Hannah turned to run, but the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. She pounded on it, screaming for help, but the house swallowed her cries. The figure loomed closer, its shadow stretching across the attic floor like a living thing. "What do you want?" Hannah pleaded, tears streaming down her face. It tilted its head, as though considering her question. "To leave," it said simply. "And now, you will take my place." Before Hannah could react, the figure lunged. The next morning, the neighbors noticed the attic window was open, a faint breeze rustling the curtains inside. When they knocked on the door to check on Hannah, no one answered. Days passed, and her family reported her missing. The police found no signs of foul play, but when they searched the attic, they found the iron lock lying on the floor and a faint message scrawled in the dust. "Don't open the door." Months later, the house was sold to a new family. On their first night, the youngest child wandered into the hallway, drawn by a faint scratching sound coming from the attic.